Have you ever wondered what really happened when a ship was taken over by pirates? Hollywood's romanticized stories have sold us a sugar-coated version of piracy, but the reality was infinitely darker. Imagine for a moment, you are sailing peacefully through the Caribbean in 1720, perhaps as a merchant or passenger, when suddenly you spot a black flag fluttering on the horizon. Your blood runs cold. It's not just the fear of death that paralyzes you, it's something far worse. It's the certainty that if you are captured alive, you will face horrors that will make you beg for death. But why exactly was being captured by pirates considered a fate worse than death itself? The answer lies not only in physical violence, though that was unimaginably brutal. It lies in the systematic breaking of human dignity, prolonged psychological torture, and practices that defy our modern understanding of cruelty. Pirates were not just criminals, they were masters of intimidation and terror. They understood perfectly well that their reputation for brutality was their most powerful weapon. The more terrible their fame, the less resistance they would face. And to maintain this reputation, they needed to turn every capture into a spectacle of horror that would spread through ports like wildfire. Consider the case of Edward Lowe, one of the most sadistic pirates of the golden age of piracy. Lowe was not content to simply kill his victims. He turned them into living messages of terror. On one documented occasion, he captured a Portuguese ship and, suspecting the captain had hidden money, ordered the captain's lips to be cut off and fried in front of him, then forced him to eat them while still hot. But this was only the appetizer for the feast of horrors to come. Physical torture was just one layer of the experience. Pirates developed a refined psychological arsenal that broke the spirit even before breaking the body. They knew a desperate man would reveal any secret, hand over any treasure, betray any ally. But how exactly did they manage to reduce respectable merchants and seasoned sailors to trembling shadows of their former selves? The process began at the moment of capture. Picture the scene. You are on the deck of a merchant ship when pirates board, shouting like demons from hell. Their clothes are blood-stained from previous conquests, their faces masks of scars and intimidating tattoos. The smell of gunpowder, sweat, and something worse, something you prefer not to identify, fills the air. This is your first taste of what's to come. But here's something you might not know. Pirates rarely started with extreme violence right away. They were, in their perverse way, brilliant strategists. First came threats, displays of power. They might pick a crew member at random and torture him in front of the others, not necessarily to get information, but to set the tone. It was an investment in fear, a currency that would pay dividends for days or weeks. The technique known as sweating was particularly diabolical. Victims were forced to run in circles around the main mast while pirates prodded them with knives and swords. It sounds almost childish compared to other tortures, doesn't it? But the evil genius of this practice lay in its duration. It was not a torture that ended quickly with death. It could last hours, even days, with pirates taking turns keeping the victim in constant motion. Physical exhaustion combined with humiliation and the terror of never knowing when or if it would end. Then there was the wooding. Do you know what that means? It involved tying a rope around the victim's head and gradually tightening it with a stick, like a tourniquet. The pressure slowly increased, causing excruciating headaches that progressed into something much worse. The eyes would begin to bulge from their sockets, the brain compressed against the skull. The victim remained conscious throughout the process, feeling every increment of pressure, knowing exactly what was happening but unable to stop it. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect was how pirates turned their victims into accomplices in their own torture. They forced prisoners to torture each other, creating a cycle of guilt and trauma that would last long beyond captivity. A merchant might be forced to whip a fellow traveler, knowing refusal would bring even worse punishment to both. This forced corruption of morality was perhaps more devastating than any physical wound. Can you imagine carrying that burden for the rest of your life? Knowing that to save your own skin, you participated in the torture of an innocent. Pirates understood that this guilt was a prison stronger than any iron shackle. Their victims would carry these invisible scars forever, even if they managed to escape. Food, or the lack thereof, was another tool of torture. Pirates didn't simply deprive their prisoners of food. They forced them to watch elaborate feasts, offered crumbs that were snatched away at the last moment, created sadistic games where food was the reward for degrading acts. Physical hunger became emotional hunger, a void consuming not just the body but the soul. And what about thirst? Pirates devised cruel refinements even for this basic need. They mixed fresh water with salt water in proportions that technically kept victims hydrated but in constant agony. Or they offered rum as the only liquid source, keeping prisoners in a state of perpetual intoxication, unable to think clearly or plan escape. But something even more sinister was at play. Pirates often kept their victims alive not only for sadistic entertainment or to extract information. They used them as bargaining chips, as living propaganda. A tortured merchant who was later released became an unwitting messenger, spreading horror stories that made other ships surrender without a fight. It was terror by proxy. Each victim became a multiplier of pirate fear. Consider for a moment the situation of a captured ship captain. Pirates knew he possessed valuable knowledge, trade routes, treasure locations, codes, and passwords, but simply torturing him until he revealed these would be a wasted opportunity. Instead, they often tortured his crew in front of him, forcing him to watch men under his command suffer for his refusal to cooperate. The guilt, the responsibility, the weight of knowing that every second of silence meant more agony for his men. This broke captains more effectively than any physical torture. The element of time was crucial in this psychological dynamic. Death is instantaneous, a moment of pain perhaps, and then nothingness. But pirate torture was designed to extend indefinitely. The victims never knew whether that day would be their last or if the suffering would continue for weeks. This uncertainty corroded the mind far more efficiently than any physical torture method. Pirates also exploited social hierarchies in particularly cruel ways. Nobles and wealthy merchants, accustomed to respect and deference, were deliberately humiliated. They were forced to perform menial tasks, treated like slaves, their social identities utterly destroyed. For men whose identity was intrinsically tied to their social status, this humiliation was devastating. And here is a detail rarely mentioned in historical accounts. Pirates often forced their victims to participate in their rituals and celebrations, not out of kindness or camaraderie, but as a final form of humiliation. Imagine being forced to toast your own capture, to sing songs celebrating the deaths of your companions, to laugh at jokes about your own suffering. This forced corruption of social normality was devastating to the human psyche. Sexual violence was another dimension of pirate terror, though it is often downplayed in historical records. Both men and women were subjected to abuses far beyond physical violence. It was a form of total domination, a complete breaking of personal autonomy. Victims were not just physically wounded, they were spiritually broken, reduced to objects for their captors' sadistic pleasure. Pirates also developed a sophisticated understanding of the psychology of hope. They offered false promises of freedom, created games where release was theoretically possible, but practically unreachable. This constant hope, followed by repeated disappointment, was crueler than simply announcing a death sentence. It kept victims emotionally invested in their own torture, always believing the next day might bring liberation. And what about those who managed to escape or were eventually freed? You might think they were the lucky ones, but the reality was more complex. Many carried traumas so deep that they never reintegrated into normal society. Some developed what we would today recognize as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Others never managed to form normal relationships again, permanently damaged by the experience. There was also the issue of credibility. When these survivors tried to tell their stories, they were often met with skepticism. Civilized people simply couldn't believe the extent of the cruelty they had endured. This social invalidation added another layer of trauma. They hadn't just been tortured, but were now treated as liars or exaggerators. Pirates understood this social dynamic perfectly. They knew their victims would often be disbelieved, which served their purposes in two ways. First, it kept the true scope of their brutality a terrible unknown. Second, it socially isolated their victims, making them less likely to seek help or cooperate with authorities. The cruel irony is that pirates, in their intuitive grasp of human psychology, were often more sophisticated than many of their so-called educated contemporaries. They developed techniques of mind control and psychological breaking that wouldn't be formally studied by psychology until centuries later. They were, in essence, inadvertent pioneers in the study of trauma and psychological manipulation. This brings us to a disturbing question. What does this tell us about human nature? How could seemingly normal individuals become capable of such systematic cruelty? The answer is not simple, but part of it lies in the social structure of pirate ships. Extreme violence became normalized, even expected. Pirates who showed weakness through compassion were often eliminated by their own comrades. But perhaps the most terrible aspect of all this is that pirates were not mythical monsters or supernatural aberrations. They were ordinary men who chose to embrace cruelty as a tool of power. And that choice, that deliberate transformation of humanity into something monstrous, is perhaps more frightening than any physical violence they could inflict. When we consider why being captured by pirates was worse than death, we cannot focus only on physical torture, brutal as it was. The true horror lay in the systematic destruction of human dignity, the forced corruption of personal morality, the complete breaking of the human spirit. Death offers an end. Pirate captivity offered only endless suffering. And here is the final question we must ask ourselves. In a world where such cruelty was not only possible, but systematized and refined, how did anyone manage to keep their humanity? Perhaps the answer lies in the fact that most did not. Those who survived pirate captivity often emerged fundamentally changed, carrying scars far beyond the physical. The golden age of piracy eventually came to an end, but the lessons about human nature it taught us remain relevant. In every era, in every society, there is potential for ordinary individuals to become monsters, for cruelty to become systematic and normalized. Pirates remind us that true horror does not come from supernatural creatures, but from the human capacity for evil when all social and moral restraints are removed. Perhaps that is why their stories still fascinate and horrify us centuries later. They represent not just a period of history, but a dark mirror of human nature itself. A reminder that under the right circumstances, any one of us can be capable of both extreme cruelty and extreme vulnerability. And in that duality lies the true reason why being captured by pirates was considered a fate worse than death, because it revealed the worst humanity had to offer, both in its perpetrators and, tragically, in its victims.